There is a stretch of coastline in northern Chile that has been silent for 149 years. The last time it broke, it killed people across 3 continents. Last night, 60 miles beneath that exact stretch of coastline, the slab that has been driving up the Andes for 200 million years broke a piece of itself in a single moment, releasing the equivalent of 25 megatons of TNT. And seismologists who have spent their careers watching this corridor looked up at the map and held their breath. It was not the earthquake they have been waiting for, but it happened in the exact place they have been waiting for it. One thing before we get into it. If you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of the next debrief. Also, leave a comment with where you're tuning in from tonight. Now let's break this down. Part 1. The quake 60 miles down. At 52 minutes past 9 o'clock at night, Coordinated Universal Time on Monday the 25th of May, 2026, a piece of the ocean floor that has been sliding underneath South America for 200 million years broke. The break happened 63 miles beneath the surface of the Atacama Desert. The nearest city on top of it was Calama, a copper mining town of 150,000 people, sitting 20 miles east of the broken piece. The shaking arrived at the surface about 30 seconds later. The lights in 22,282 homes went out. A water main split open. 3,000 more homes lost their potable water. And then, within about 10 minutes, an automated message went out from a sensor network thousands of miles away on the coast of Hawaii. The message said a tsunami warning had been issued for the coast of northern Chile. The message was wrong, or at least technically the message was right, but the thing it was warning about could not happen. The earthquake was too deep. The earthquake was so deep that it shouldn't have moved the ocean at all, and within a few hours the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, which had issued the warning, took it back. The Hydrographic and Oceanographic Service of the Chilean Navy, which goes by the abbreviation SHOA, said the same thing. The earthquake did not meet the conditions necessary to generate a tsunami. There was no wave coming. There had never been a wave coming. The warning had been automatic, a reflex from a system that doesn't know yet how deep an earthquake is when it first hears about it, only how big. The size was where the messiness started. The first agency to put a number on it was the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center itself. They called it a magnitude 6.8. Then the European Mediterranean Seismological Center, which monitors quakes from a network of stations across Europe and around the world, put it at magnitude 6.9. Then the United States Geological Survey, working from a different network of stations and using a different calculation method, settled on 6.9 as well. The Chilean National Seismological Center, the country's own monitoring agency, agreed. Live broadcasters who were online when the quake hit reported it first as a 6.7. Within an hour, the number had floated upward to 6.8, then 6.9, and then the agencies converged on the higher value. None of this was a cover-up, and none of it was a downgrade. It was just what the first hour of a large earthquake looks like. We will come back to this because it matters. Magnitude variance in the first 60 minutes after a major rupture is one of the most misread phenomena in modern seismology, and the audience that watched the number tick upward on a live stream did not get a cover-up. They got a real-time view of what science looks like before the final answer comes in. The depth is what makes this story different from almost every other earthquake of comparable size on this corridor. The depth was, depending on which agency you asked, between 95 and 109 kilometers. Multiple early reports converged on a value near 101 kilometers, or about 63 miles. To put that in perspective, the deepest hole humans have ever drilled into the surface of this planet, the Kola Super Deep borehole in northwestern Russia, reached a depth of 12.2 kilometers before the rock got so hot the drill stopped working. The earthquake on May 25th happened about 8 times deeper than that. It happened in a place where no instrument we have ever built will ever physically go. Everything we know about what happened down there, we know from listening to the sound the rupture made on its way to the surface and reading the pattern of that sound at hundreds of seismographic stations across the planet. What we know is this. The Nazca plate, the slab of oceanic crust that floors the southeastern Pacific Ocean, is sliding underneath the South American plate at a rate of about 9 centimeters per year, about 3.5 inches, about the rate your fingernails grow if your fingernails grew in only one direction and never stopped. That movement has been continuous, more or less, for the entire history of the Andes Mountains, which were not there 200 million years ago, and which are now 7,000 kilometers of vertical rock running down the western edge of an entire continent. The Andes are the receipt for what the Nazca Plate has been doing. They are the surface signature of a process that operates mostly 60 miles beneath the surface. On the night of May 25th, in a single moment, that process produced an earthquake. The slab broke inside itself, not at the boundary where the slab meets the rest of the planet, which is where the truly enormous Chilean earthquakes come from, inside itself. A piece of the slab fractured against another piece of the slab, 60 miles down, because the slab is bending and stretching and folding as it dives under the continent, and at that depth the rock is under stresses that, every so often, exceed what it can hold. Geologists call this an intraslab earthquake. The intra means inside. The slab broke inside itself. That is the simplest version of what happened. The longer version, and the version this video is going to spend the next 2 hours on, is what it means that the slab broke right there, right then, 60 miles below a stretch of coastline that seismologists have been watching, with growing concern for 149 years. Because the spot where the slab broke projects upward to a particular section of the Peru-Chile subduction zone, the boundary along which the great Chilean earthquakes occur, that has been silent since the year 1877. We will get to 1877. We will spend a lot of time on 1877, and on the corridor it ruptured, and on the fact that most of that rupture has not happened again since. But first, before we get there, we need to talk about a number that doesn't quite add up. A magnitude 6.9 earthquake released on May 25th, somewhere on the order of 10 to the 14th joules of energy. That is roughly 25 megatons of TNT equivalent. To put that in perspective, the largest nuclear weapon ever tested, the Tsar bomber detonated by the Soviet Union in 1961, released about 50 megatons of energy. The earthquake on May 25th was about half the energy of the largest bomb ever built by human hands, released in a single moment, 60 miles inside the planet, with no human cause and no human involvement at all. It killed nobody. It injured nobody. The buildings of Calama, designed to withstand exactly this kind of event, because the city has lived on top of this subduction zone for as long as the city has existed, mostly held. The mining infrastructure to the north of the city, including one of the largest open-pit copper mines on Earth, kept operating. And the next morning, life went on. That is the strange truth about a country that lives on top of the most seismically active subduction zone on the planet. A magnitude 6.9 is, by Chilean standards, big enough to take seriously and small enough to absorb. Chile has built itself for this. Chile has been built, repeatedly after the fact, for this. The country's modern construction codes were rewritten after the 1960 Valdivia earthquake, the largest earthquake ever recorded on this planet, which struck the coastline of southern Chile and produced a tsunami that crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and killed people in Japan 22 hours later. Those construction codes were rewritten again after the 2010 Mall earthquake, a magnitude 8.8 that ruptured the coastline of central Chile. They have been refined again with every major event since. The result is that, in Chile, a magnitude 6.9 is the kind of event that closes a few roads, knocks out the power in a few neighbourhoods, and gets logged in the catalogue by the next morning. In a country that did not have this engineering culture, the same event might have killed hundreds. In Chile, it killed nobody. That is not an accident. That is what 150 years of writing the engineering manual after the fact looks like. We're going to come back to the country's relationship with its own ground, because it is the most important context for understanding why this particular earthquake matters and why it does not. But before we get to the country, we need to start where the earthquake actually arrived first. We need to start on the surface, in a copper mining city in the high desert, on a Monday afternoon, when the ground started moving. Part 2. Calama, the Atacama, and a city that builds copper. Calama sits at 22 degrees and 28 minutes south latitude, on the eastern edge of the Atacama Desert, at an elevation of about 7,400 feet above sea level. The Atacama is the driest non-polar place on Earth. Some weather stations in the Atacama have measured rainfall in single-millimetre quantities over decade-long timeframes. The desert is a strip of land roughly 600 miles long, pinned between the Pacific Ocean to the west and the Andes Mountains to the east. It runs along the western edge of Chile from the Peru border down toward the city of La Serena, and Calama is roughly in the middle of it. Calama is a copper town. It exists because, about 10 miles north of where the city proper sits, the open-pit copper mine of Chuquicamata has been operating more or less continuously for over 100 years. Chuquicamata is one of the largest open-pit mines in the world. The largest pit is approximately 1,000 meters deep, that is, about 3,300 feet straight down into the desert floor, and several kilometers across at the rim. It is so large that you can see it from space without any optical assistance. It appears on satellite imagery as a circular wound on the planet's surface, the color of crushed copper. The Chilean state copper company, Codelco, runs it. It produces every year, on the order of hundreds of thousands of metric tons of refined copper. A meaningful fraction of the world's copper supply has passed through this hole. The town of Calama was originally about 15 kilometers south of the mine itself. Beginning in 2004, a smaller settlement that had grown up right next to the mine, also called Chuquicamata, was systematically relocated to Calama. By 2007, the original Chuquicamata settlement was abandoned, its houses left behind, its school closed, its residents resettled into Calama proper. The official reason was that the expanding mine had to consume the ground where the houses stood. The unofficial reason was that the air quality next to a 100-year-old open-pit copper smelting operation was no longer compatible with people living next to it. Either way, Calama absorbed the population. Today the city has a population of about 170,000 people, the majority of whom work directly or indirectly for the copper industry. When the earthquake hit on May 25th, 22,282 homes in Calama lost electrical power. That number is precise because the local utility, which monitors connections, reported it within hours. A water main also broke somewhere in the distribution network, and 3,000 homes lost their potable water supply. Nobody was hurt. The damage was characterized by news reporting from Chile as light to moderate. Buildings cracked. Things fell off shelves. The cathedral, which dates from the early 20th century, was inspected and reported intact. The mining infrastructure to the north of the city was inspected for damage. Codelco issued a statement that operations at Chuquicamata had not been significantly affected. Now that statement matters more than it might sound. The Talabra tailings storage facility, the place where the leftover ground-up rock from copper extraction is dumped after the copper itself has been chemically removed, is one of the largest tailings dams in South America. It is located between the mine itself and the city of Calama. It is, in essence, an artificial lake of mining slurry held back by an engineered earth structure. In Chile, where seismic risk to mining infrastructure is one of the most studied and monitored aspects of the entire mining industry, the tailings dam is the structure people who worry about earthquakes worry about. A failure of a tailings dam during a major earthquake is a catastrophe. The pasty, toxic mining slurry, released suddenly, can flow downstream like a wet avalanche, and it does not stop until it reaches lower ground or open ocean. The Talabra Dam survived May 25th without reported damage. Codelco's statement to that effect is, for everyone downstream of the dam, the most important sentence to come out of the day. The reason it survived is that Chile has, for decades, been one of the strictest jurisdictions in the world for the seismic engineering of mining facilities. Chile has had to be. The country has experienced more large earthquakes per square kilometre in the last 100 years than nearly any other country on Earth, and the engineering profession in Chile has, as a matter of cultural and economic survival, internalized this in a way that most other countries have not. The economic stakes of the Talabra Dam holding are not small. Copper is, by some measures, the single most important industrial metal on the planet. It is the conductive substance that runs electricity through every wire in every building. It is the material that makes electric motors work, that makes transformers work, that makes the long-distance transmission lines that carry electricity from generating stations to cities work. The global demand for copper has been rising steadily for decades and is projected to continue rising as more of the world's energy infrastructure electrifies. Chile produces by itself somewhere on the order of 1/4 of the world's copper supply. Chuquicamata is one of the central mines in that production. If the Talabra tailings dam ever fails, in a major earthquake, in a structural collapse, in some failure mode nobody has yet anticipated, the immediate environmental consequence is local, but the consequences for the global copper supply chain ripple outward to every electrified country on the planet. A USGS open file report from 2024 estimated that earthquake disruption to Chilean copper production carries the highest aggregated seismic risk of any country in the global copper supply, and that the disruption could affect not just copper, but rhenium, a rare metal extracted as a byproduct of copper, refining that is essential to high-temperature alloys used in jet engines. The May 25th event did not cause that kind of disruption. But the next much larger event, when it comes, could. That is the city the earthquake landed on, a high desert copper town, 170,000 people, sitting on top of a slab of ocean floor that has been moving westward to eastward for 200 million years. The slab is what we need to talk about next, because the slab is the protagonist of this entire story. The slab is the thing that broke. The slab is the thing that is, even right now as you're listening to this, still moving. And the slab is the thing that is going to break again, somewhere at some time, in a way that we cannot yet predict but can confidently assume will eventually come. Part 3. Why the number kept changing. If you were online when the quake hit, and millions of people were, because Chilean earthquakes generate immediate global interest among the seismically literate community on social media and on live monitoring channels, you saw the number change in real time. The first reports, from broadcasters monitoring the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, were of a magnitude 6.7. Within minutes, the PTWC itself updated to a magnitude 6.8. The European Mediterranean Seismological Center, working from its own data, reported 6.9. The United States Geological Survey, reviewing its own automated solution, settled on 6.9. The Chilean National Seismological Center, also called CSN, used its own dense network of in-country stations to lock in a value that converged with the international agencies at 6.9. For anyone watching, this looks like inconsistency. It looks like uncertainty, or worse, like someone is hiding something. It is neither. It is, in fact, the most normal thing in the world for a major earthquake, and understanding why is one of the most useful pieces of seismological media literacy you can carry. When an earthquake happens, the rupture itself takes time. A magnitude 6.9 event releases its energy over the course of roughly several seconds. The shaking that we experience at the surface is the result of seismic waves radiating outward from the rupture zone in all directions. There are two main types of waves, which seismologists call P waves and S waves. P waves, or primary waves, are compression waves. They move through rock the way sound moves through air, by compressing and decompressing the medium. They travel at about 6 kilometers per second through continental crust, and they are the first waves to arrive at any distant seismograph station. S waves, or secondary waves, are shear waves. They move through rock by deforming it sideways, the way you might shake a long rope to make a wiggle travel down its length. They travel at about 3.5 kilometers per second, which means they arrive at any distant station several seconds after the P waves, with the delay between them growing larger the farther the station is from the rupture. When seismologists determine magnitude, they're reading the amplitude, the size, of these waves as recorded at multiple stations, and then doing some math to back out what the rupture itself must have looked like. The magnitude scale most commonly reported for events of this size, called moment magnitude or FU, is calculated from the total energy released, which is itself calculated from the area of fault that ruptured, multiplied by how far it slipped, multiplied by the rigidity of the rock. None of those numbers are directly measured. All of them are inferred from the wave signatures, and the inferences require a few minutes, sometimes more than a few minutes, of careful processing once the waves have arrived at enough stations to constrain the solution. In the first minute or two after a major earthquake, what the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center does is fire off a preliminary magnitude based on the first waves to reach a regional set of stations. This is a fast estimate. It is deliberately fast because the alternative, waiting for the full reviewed solution, could mean delaying tsunami warnings for events that genuinely need them. The PTWC is, by design, willing to be wrong in the first hour in order to be right in the first minute. The European Mediterranean Seismological Center works similarly, but uses a different network of stations and a slightly different processing pipeline. The USGS uses its own global station network, which has its own particular geographic biases. Stations are dense in some parts of the world and sparse in others, and the magnitude calculation depends on which stations you happen to have data from at the moment of estimation. The Chilean National Seismological Center has, predictably, the densest network of stations within Chile itself, which gives it the most precise local data, but a different angle on the global wave field. All four of these agencies will, given enough time, converge on a value within about 1/10 of a magnitude unit of one another. None of them will, in the first 10 minutes, be in perfect agreement. This is why the number kept changing. 6.7, then 6.8, then 6.9, then a final agency consensus value of 6.9. The change is not a magnitude suppression. The change is not an upgrade in the sense of they kept finding more damage. The change is the inherent mathematical reality of how magnitude is determined from a growing set of incoming wave data over the first hour after a rupture. The mathematical reality is that the seismic waves from a magnitude 6.9 earthquake at 100 kilometers depth radiate outward in all directions through a planet that is not uniformly transparent to those waves. The crust slows them down in places. The mantle bends them along certain paths. They reflect off internal boundaries within the planet and arrive at distant stations along multiple different paths with different arrival times and different amplitudes. The job of a magnitude calculation is to take all of those station readings, correct for the path each wave took, back out what the rupture itself must have looked like, and produce a single number that summarizes the energy released. The accuracy of that calculation depends on having waveforms from many stations distributed in many directions. In the first 60 seconds after a rupture, only the closest stations have received waves. In the first 10 minutes, regional stations have received them. In the first hour, the entire global network has the data. The magnitude estimate tightens as more data arrives. The final number, the reviewed solution that USGS and EMSC and CSN all converge on, is the result of integrating waveforms from hundreds of stations across the planet, processed and cross-checked by multiple independent calculation pipelines. There is a piece of folk wisdom in the conspiracy-adjacent corners of the internet that says when the magnitude number changes, you should assume the higher number is the real one, and the lower number is what they want you to think. This is wrong. The reality is closer to the opposite. The first number reported is almost always an undercall, because the first arriving waves don't capture the full rupture, and the full rupture is what determines the final magnitude. The number tends to drift upward as the calculation refines, not because anything is being hidden, but because the math is converging on the truth from below. When the magnitude finally locks in at 6.9, 6.9 is the truth. 6.7 was the best guess available in the first 60 seconds. Both numbers were honest, given what was knowable at the time. This matters for the May 25th event in particular, because the number reached at the end of the first hour, 6.9, is the actual magnitude. There was no 8.5 in this event, there was no 7.5. The Quake Gap megathrust earthquake that seismologists have been waiting on for 149 years did not happen on May 25th, 2026. What happened was a 6.9 intra-slab event, 60 miles deep, inside the slab. Not on the boundary, not at the surface, not at the depth where the great Chilean earthquakes are born. The distinction between intraslab and interplate, between an earthquake that happens inside the diving plate and an earthquake that happens at the boundary between the diving plate and the continental plate above it, is the single most important distinction for understanding what this event actually means. Because the great Chilean earthquakes, the ones that the country has been writing history about for 500 years, are interplate events. They happen on the boundary, they happen at shallower depth, and they release 100 to 1,000 times more energy than a 6.9 intraslab event. That distinction is what the next several parts of this video are about. We need to talk about the slab itself, because the slab is the thing that broke, and then we need to talk about the boundary above the slab, because the boundary is the thing that, eventually, will break in a much larger way. And then we need to talk about what one tells us about the other, because the answer is more interesting than either the conspiracy theorists or the alarmists will admit. Part 4. The slab that is pulling a continent. There is a particular slab of oceanic crust at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean off the coast of South America that has a name. It is called the Nazca Plate. The name comes from a city in southern Peru, Nazca, which is itself famous for an entirely different reason: the enormous geoglyphs carved into the desert there by the ancient Nazca culture between roughly 200 BC and 600 AD. The tectonic plate borrowed the name because the city of Nazca sits roughly above the eastern edge of the plate's current position. The Nazca plate is about 2.5 million square miles in area. Most of it is at the bottom of the Pacific. Its western edge, called the East Pacific Rise, is where new oceanic crust is being created. Molten rock pushes up from the mantle along that ridge, cools, and adds new material to both sides. The Nazca plate, as a result, is moving eastward, away from the East Pacific Rise and toward the South American continent. Its eastern edge runs along the Peru-Chile Trench, which is one of the deepest features on Earth, in places more than 8,000 meters below sea level, 26,000 feet deep, twice the depth of the Grand Canyon if you carved the Grand Canyon downward into the ocean floor. The trench runs almost the entire length of the western coast of South America, from the southern Caribbean down to the latitude of central Chile. At the trench, the Nazca plate dives. It begins descending into the mantle at an angle that varies along its length but averages in northern Chile about 25 to 30 degrees below horizontal. The plate keeps going down. By the time it reaches a depth of 100 kilometers, 62 miles, it has traveled, horizontally, about 300 kilometers from the trench. By the time it reaches 300 kilometers depth, which is approximately the deepest detectable earthquakes on this corridor, it has traveled about 1,000 kilometers horizontally and is no longer beneath any land at all but beneath the deep interior of the South American continent. The rate at which the Nazca plate is doing this is approximately 9 centimeters per year in northern Chile. 9 centimeters is a little less than 4 inches per year, continuously, for the past several million years. It has not paused, it has not reversed direction. The Nazca plate is moving forward, eastward, downward, into the planet, every second of every day, including right now while you are listening to me. The South American plate, meanwhile, is doing the opposite. It is being pushed westward by the spreading of the mid-Atlantic ridge, which is creating new Atlantic Ocean floor between South America and Africa at a rate of a few centimeters per year. The South American plate, pushed from behind by Atlantic spreading, is colliding with the diving Nazca plate from the east. The collision is the reason the Andes exist. Every centimeter of horizontal motion that the South American plate cannot accomplish, because the Nazca plate is in the way, has to be accommodated vertically. The Andes have risen over millions of years to take up the difference. The current rate of Andean uplift is about 10 millimeters per year. The southern Altiplano, the high plateau between the mountain chains of the Andes, gained 2.5 kilometers in elevation between 16 million years ago and 9 million years ago, a vertical rise of more than a mile in 7 million years. That is the kind of motion the slab forces on the surface above it. This is not a metaphor. This is not a scientific abstraction. The literal mountain range you can see in photographs from any town along the western edge of Argentina, or Bolivia or Peru or Chile, is the direct physical measurable surface signature of the Nazca plate diving into the planet. The continent above the slab is being pushed. The Andes are the buckle in the carpet. If you stand in Calama and look east, you see the western foothills of the Andes climbing toward the high Bolivian Altiplano. If you stand in the same place and look west, you see the long downhill slope toward the Pacific coast. The land slopes upward toward the mountains and downward toward the sea, and the slope is one of the most distinctive geographic features of northern Chile. That slope exists because the surface above the diving slab is being deformed. The diving slab pulls the western edge of the continent downward slightly, creating the coastal lowland. The resistance to the slab's eastward motion shoves the interior upward, creating the Andes. The deformation is not perfectly symmetrical, and is not perfectly linear with depth, but the overall pattern is unmistakable. The surface of South America in northern Chile is being shaped by what is happening 60 miles down. The May 25th earthquake was, in a sense, the slab reminding the surface what it has been doing all along. Now here is the part that connects this to the earthquake on May 25th. As the Nazca plate dives downward, it does not glide smoothly. It bends, it folds, it stretches in some places, it compresses in others. And the rock, which is brittle in the upper 100 kilometers or so, breaks. The breakage is what we measure as earthquakes. Most of those earthquakes are tiny, magnitude 1 or 2 or 3, well below human perception, recorded only by sensitive instruments. Some are larger, a few are very large. A handful, over centuries, are catastrophic. The depth at which the earthquakes happen depends on the geometry of the slab and the stresses it is carrying. Earthquakes within the slab itself, intraslab earthquakes, which is what May 25th was, happen at depths anywhere from about 30 kilometers down to as deep as 300 kilometers, where the rock finally becomes too hot to fracture brittly and instead deforms by slow flow. Earthquakes on the boundary between the slab and the overlying continent, interplate earthquakes, the ones that produce the Great Chilean disasters, happen at shallower depths, generally between about 10 and 50 kilometers. The May 25th event was at approximately 101 kilometers depth, give or take. That is solidly inside the slab. That is not on the boundary. And that is what makes it an intraslab earthquake, and what makes it a different kind of event from the ones that the Quake seismic gap is loaded for. The slab broke itself 60 miles down. That is what happened. Part 5. 60 miles below. The desert. The geometry of an intraslab quake. To understand why the slab broke itself 60 miles down on May 25th, you need to understand a feature of the Nazca plate that is, geologically speaking, weird. Northern Chile has one of the most distinctive intermediate depth seismicity patterns of any subduction zone on Earth. The pattern has been studied for decades and was characterized in detail by a series of papers published in the late 2010s and early 2020s, including a particularly important Bloch et al. Paper in the journal Lithos in 2019 that addressed exactly this corridor. The pattern works like this. In most subduction zones around the world, earthquakes inside the diving slab are organized into what seismologists call a double seismic zone. Two parallel layers of earthquake activity separated by about 30 kilometers, one along the upper surface of the slab and another deeper inside it. The two layers correspond to different physical processes. The upper layer is mostly dehydration related. Water trapped in the oceanic crust as it formed at the East Pacific Rise gets squeezed out as the slab descends and heats up, and the release of that water triggers earthquakes. The lower layer is mostly mineral phase transitions and thermal stresses. As the slab descends into hotter mantle, certain minerals in the deeper part of the slab transform into denser forms, and the transformation generates stress that occasionally exceeds the strength of the rock. In northern Chile, that pattern changes at a particular depth. Above 80 kilometers depth, the standard double seismic zone is clearly visible. Two parallel bands of earthquakes, separated by about 30 kilometers, both following the dip of the slab. Below 80 kilometers, the two bands merge into a single, thick, concentrated layer of intense seismicity that extends from 80 kilometers depth down to about 150 kilometers depth. Within that concentrated band, earthquakes happen far more frequently than in equivalent depth ranges in other subduction zones around the world. This is unusual. Most other subduction zones do not show this kind of concentrated, anomalously high intraslab seismicity at intermediate depths. There has been substantial scientific work on why northern Chile is different. The current best understanding involves a combination of factors: the age of the oceanic crust being subducted at this latitude, the rate of subduction, the angle of subduction, the thickness of the slab, the temperature gradient inside the slab, and possibly some specific features of the oceanic crust being subducted that have not yet been fully characterized. There is no single, simple answer to why northern Chile shows this pattern, but the pattern itself is well documented and has been peer-reviewed across multiple independent research groups. The May 25th earthquake happened squarely inside this concentrated zone. At 101 kilometers depth, the consensus value across agencies, the rupture was in the heart of the band, in the depth range where the upper and lower seismic layers have merged into a single thick seismogenic volume. The focal mechanism, which is the technical term for the orientation of the fault that ruptured, was consistent with what most intraslab earthquakes in northern Chile show, a tension axis oriented roughly east-west and dipping at about 20 to 30 degrees, aligned with the slab itself. In plain language, the slab broke along its own internal grain. It pulled itself apart slightly, in the direction it is being stretched as it dives into the planet. That detail is important because it tells us this was not a freak event. This was the kind of event that the slab does, in this corridor, on a regular basis. There have been magnitude 6 and larger intraslab events in northern Chile every few years, for as long as instrumental monitoring has existed. The slab breaks itself, at this depth, in this orientation, with this kind of mechanism, more or less continuously. The May 25th event was simply on the larger end of the normal range. It was also, however, the largest event on the global earthquake feed for the entire previous 7 days. The next largest event on the same feed was approximately magnitude 5.6, more than 10 times less energetic. So while the May 25th event was normal for northern Chile, it was the largest single rupture anywhere on the planet that week. That combination, locally routine, globally headline, is exactly the kind of event that draws attention from people who don't normally pay attention to earthquakes. And the attention raises the question of what it means. The answer, geologically, is that it means the slab is doing what the slab does. The slab is breaking itself, on schedule, with the same mechanism, in the same corridor. There is no specific reason to read this particular event as signalling anything dramatic about what comes next. But there is also a reason that some seismologists, when they saw this event come across the wire, looked up at the map and held their breath for a moment. Because the location, projected upward to the surface, lands directly above a stretch of coastline that has been silent for 149 years. And the silence is what they are paying attention to, not the noise. It is worth pausing for a moment on what intraslab actually looks like at the rock mechanics level. When the Nazca plate was created at the East Pacific Rise millions of years ago, the molten rock that became the slab was hot, plastic, and structurally weak. As the slab moved eastward across the Pacific Basin, it cooled. By the time it reached the Peru-Chile Trench, the upper part of the slab had been exposed to seawater for tens of millions of years and was rich in hydrated minerals that contain water in their crystal structures. As the slab dove into the trench and descended into the hotter interior of the planet, it heated back up. The hydrated minerals began to break down at certain depth and temperature thresholds, releasing water back out of the slab. That water release is one of the main mechanisms behind intraslab earthquakes. At depths where dehydration is happening, the released water reduces the strength of the rock and allows pre-existing stresses to fracture it. Different minerals break down at different depths. Some release water at 30 kilometers, some at 60, some at 100, some at deeper levels still. The pattern of intraslab seismicity in any subduction zone is, in part, a map of the dehydration events happening in the descending plate. The intense intermediate depth seismicity in northern Chile is, the working hypothesis goes, related in part to the specific mineralogy of the Nazca crust at this latitude and the specific temperature regime it encounters as it descends. The May 25th earthquake, 60 miles down, was the slab breaking at a depth where one of those mineral transitions is happening, in rock that has been hydrated by seawater absorbed millions of years ago and is now releasing that water under high pressure and rising temperature. That is the actual physical picture. It is more interesting than the conspiracy theories, and it is what the science says. Part 6. A tsunami warning that couldn't cause a tsunami. At 22:02 UTC on May 25th, exactly 10 minutes after the mainshock, NOAA's Pacific Tsunami Warning Center issued a tsunami warning for the coast of northern Chile. The warning was specific. It identified the affected area near 22.5 degrees south latitude, 69 degrees west longitude, a location just inland from the coast of the Antofagasta region. The warning was, in the moment, real. It went out to coastal alerting systems. It triggered automatic notifications. Anyone monitoring NOAA's tsunami warning feeds in those minutes saw it appear, and would have, reasonably, prepared for the possibility of a real wave hitting somewhere along the South American coast. Within a few hours, the warning was cleared. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center itself, after more careful analysis, determined that the event posed no tsunami threat. The Hydrographic and Oceanographic Service of the Chilean Navy, SHO, issued its own statement saying the earthquake's characteristics did not meet the conditions necessary to generate a tsunami. The all-clear was given, there was no wave, there had never been a wave. For the audience watching this happen, the obvious question is, why did the warning go out in the first place? If the earthquake couldn't physically generate a tsunami, why did the automated system flash a warning for it? The answer is in how tsunami warnings work, and in how they have to work to be useful. Tsunamis are generated when an earthquake, or more rarely a submarine landslide or volcanic eruption, abruptly displaces a large volume of water. The displacement happens because the seafloor itself moves upward or downward suddenly, pushing the water above it. For an earthquake to do this efficiently, 3 conditions have to be met. The earthquake has to be in the ocean or directly offshore. The earthquake has to be shallow enough that the rupture extends to or near the seafloor, and the earthquake has to be on a fault whose orientation produces vertical seafloor motion, which generally means a thrust fault, where one block of crust is shoving up over another. A magnitude 6.9 earthquake at 100 kilometers depth fails on the second condition. The rupture, 60 miles inside the planet, does not extend to the seafloor. The seafloor itself does not move significantly. The water above does not get pushed. There is no wave. But the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center's first-pass algorithm in the moments after an earthquake doesn't have enough information to know all of this. It knows the magnitude, approximately. It knows the rough location. It knows whether the event was in a coastal subduction zone. For any large earthquake in a coastal subduction zone, the default response of the algorithm is to issue a warning and then refine. The cost of issuing a warning that gets cleared is generally lower than the cost of failing to issue a warning that should have gone out. So the algorithm errs on the side of warning, and then the human analysts and the deeper modelling, over the next hour, refine the picture and either escalate the warning or clear it. In the May 25th case, the warning was cleared. The depth and mechanism, once analysed, made the no tsunami answer clear. Shaw, working from its own local data, reached the same conclusion. The system, as designed, did exactly what it was supposed to do: flash a warning fast, then refine. That is the technical answer. The deeper answer is that this particular event was a kind of stress test for how tsunami warning systems handle ambiguity. A magnitude 6.9 in a Chilean subduction zone is, on its face, the kind of event that demands an automatic warning. The depth that makes it physically incapable of producing a tsunami is the kind of information that takes a few minutes to integrate into the assessment. The system is built to be fast first and accurate second, and for the audience that watch the warning appear and then disappear, the lesson is that automatic warnings are first drafts, not final answers. The warning being issued and then cleared is not a failure of the system. It is the system working exactly as intended. It is also worth understanding how the depth-based clearance works in practice. When a large earthquake happens in a subduction zone, the Tsunami Warning Center has a few minutes to make a call. The first piece of information available is the magnitude estimate, which, as we discussed, is rough in the first few minutes. The second piece of information is the rough location, which is usually pretty good. Modern seismographic networks can locate an earthquake within about 10 kilometers within 30 seconds of the first wave arrivals. The third piece of information is the rough depth, which is harder to pin down quickly because it requires waveforms from stations at multiple distances to constrain. In the first 30 seconds after a major earthquake, depth estimates can be wrong by tens of kilometers. By 2 minutes in, the depth estimate has typically tightened to within 10 or 20 kilometers of the true value. By 5 to 10 minutes in, the depth estimate is generally reliable. So the warning systems are operating in a moving target environment where the depth, which is the single most important parameter for determining whether the event can generate a tsunami, is the least well constrained in the moments when the warning has to be issued. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center's algorithm handles this uncertainty by issuing the warning first based on the magnitude and location signature, and then refining the assessment as the depth solution improves. For the May 25th event, the initial warning was issued within 10 minutes. By the time the depth solution had tightened to its final value of approximately 100 kilometers, the warning could be confidently cleared, and it was. The whole process, from initial warning to final clearance, played out over roughly an hour and a half. Anyone monitoring the warning feed in those 90 minutes saw the system work through its own data, in real time, with no human involvement that would have meaningfully changed the outcome. The warning was issued because the algorithm said to issue it. The warning was cleared because the data said to clear it. Nothing was hidden, nothing was suppressed, and nothing about the sequence of events was unusual for a subduction zone earthquake of this magnitude. There is, however, a piece of online conspiracy theorizing that goes the other direction. The argument runs like this. The warning was issued because the actual event was much larger than reported. They downgraded the magnitude to 6.9 to prevent panic. The tsunami warning is the proof that something bigger really happened, and the no tsunami announcement is the cover-up. This argument fails for several reasons. First, the tsunami warning was generated by an automated system that responds to the initial estimated magnitude before any human can intervene. If the system thought the event was an 8.5, the warning would have been an evacuation order, not a watch. And the warning issued was a watch, not an evacuation order, which is itself a signal of the system's red on the event's size. Second, the magnitude was determined independently by at least 4 separate agencies: USGS, EMSC, PTWC, and Chile's own CSN, and all 4 converged on the same value. For the magnitude to have been suppressed, all 4 agencies would have had to coordinate. They do not coordinate. They actively compete for accuracy because professional reputation in seismology depends on it. Third, the seismic waveforms from the event are now sitting on public servers at every major global station network. Anyone with the software and the training can pull the waveforms and do their own magnitude calculation. If the magnitude were suppressed, independent researchers would have published a correction within hours. None did, because there is nothing to correct. The simpler explanation, in this case, is the correct one. The earthquake was a magnitude 6.9. The depth was 101 kilometers. The mechanism could not generate a tsunami. The warning went out because of an automated threshold and was cleared after analysis. Nothing was hidden. The system worked. And the warning, for the few hours it was active, was a useful reminder of something the people who live in Calama and along the Antofagasta coast already know, which is that they live next to a subduction zone that can, when conditions are right, produce earthquakes that do generate tsunamis. The May 25th event was not one of those, but the next one might be, and we will get to that. Part 7. Aftershocks that went the wrong direction. In the hours after the main shock, the seismographic stations around the world began picking up the aftershock sequence. The Chilean National Seismological Center reported at least 9 smaller earthquakes following the main shock, including a magnitude 4.3 within the first reporting window. 2 of those aftershocks were larger than the rest and worth looking at carefully. The first was a magnitude 4.8, recorded at 22:03 UTC, 11 minutes after the main shock, at a depth of 114.776 kilometers, with a location approximately 10 kilometers east of Calama. The second was also magnitude 4.8, at virtually the same time, recorded by the European Mediterranean Seismological Center at a depth of 122.6 kilometers, at a slightly different location within the same Antofagasta corridor. These 2 solutions may represent the same earthquake catalogued by 2 different agencies with slightly different inversions, or they may represent 2 separate but nearly simultaneous events. Either way, what they have in common is a depth that is deeper than the main shock. The main shock was at 101 kilometers. The largest aftershocks were at 114 and 122 kilometers respectively. That is unusual. The reason it is unusual has to do with how aftershock sequences typically organize themselves. In most earthquake sequences, aftershocks cluster around the main shock rupture in 3 dimensions, some shallower, some deeper, some to the north, some to the south. The aftershock distribution traces out, roughly, the shape of the fault that ruptured and the surrounding volume where stress has been redistributed. The largest aftershocks are typically within about half a magnitude unit of the main shock and are most often at or near the main shock depth, not significantly deeper. When the largest aftershocks of an intraslab event are systematically deeper than the main shock, it suggests something specific. It suggests that the rupture is not confined to a single fault plane, but is reorganizing along the slab's internal geometry. The slab itself is a 3-dimensional body of rock, dipping into the mantle at about 30 degrees. A rupture inside the slab that propagates along the slab's dip direction will, by definition, extend to deeper depths as it moves eastward. If the aftershocks are tracing the slab's dip, they will show up deeper, not shallower. That is consistent with what we are seeing. The aftershocks are following the slab's geometry, rather than radiating spherically from a point source. The slab is reorganizing internally, redistributing stress along its own internal structure, and the resulting smaller ruptures are happening deeper inside the slab than the main shock was. This is not, by itself, alarming. Slab reorganization is a normal part of how intraslab sequences work. But it is worth flagging because it tells us something about the character of the main shock. The event on May 25th was not a point source rupture on a small fault. It was a rupture inside a much larger volume of stressed rock, and the volume itself is now adjusting in response. There is a separate question, which the conspiracy-adjacent commentary online has raised, which is whether the unusual aftershock pattern means that something larger is coming. The argument runs, if the aftershocks are migrating deeper and the slab is reorganizing, doesn't that mean the slab is being progressively destabilized, and isn't a much larger rupture the logical next step? The answer is no, with caveats. Slab reorganization following an intraslab event is the slab settling into a new stress equilibrium, not loading up for a larger one. The main shock was the release of stress that had built up to the point of failure. The aftershocks are smaller ruptures that occur as the surrounding rock adjusts to the new stress configuration. The system is moving towards stability, not away from it. The probability of a larger intraslab event in the same corridor in the days or weeks after the main shock is statistically higher than the long-term background rate. That is just Barth's law, which says aftershocks are typically about 1 magnitude unit smaller than the main shock but occasionally violate that expectation. But higher than background in this case still means quite low in absolute terms, and there is no specific signature in the current aftershock sequence that would indicate an imminent larger rupture. The caveat is that intraslab events do not in general predict megathrust events. The two kinds of earthquakes happen on different surfaces, at different depths, driven by different physical processes. An intraslab event in the depth range of 100 kilometers does not, in any well-documented way, advance or retard the timing of a megathrust event on the boundary above it. The stress transfer between the two surfaces is small and complex, and the literature on this is unsettled, but generally agrees that the influence is not significant for predictive purposes. So the aftershocks are doing something interesting, migrating deeper, tracking the slab's internal geometry, and that interesting behavior is informative about the structure of the rupture. But it is not, by any reading of the science I can find, evidence that something larger is imminent. The slab is doing what slabs do after they break themselves. The corridor above is doing what it has been doing for 149 years, which is to say nothing. That silence is the next subject, because the silence is paradoxically the part that seismologists pay the most attention to. Part 8. The year. 1877. On the 9th of May, in the year 1877, at 16 minutes past 9 o'clock at night local time, an earthquake of an estimated moment magnitude between 8.5 and 8.8 ruptured approximately 500 kilometers of the Peru-Chile subduction zone offshore of northern Chile. The rupture was on the interplate boundary, the contact surface between the Nazca plate and the South American plate, at depths between roughly 10 and 50 kilometers. It was the great megathrust earthquake of northern Chile in the 19th century. It was, in terms of pure energy release, somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times more powerful than the event on May 25, 2026. The earthquake itself was felt across an enormous area. The shaking caused major damage in the coastal cities of Pisagua, Iquique and Arica. But the earthquake was not the deadliest part of the event. The deadliest part was the tsunami that followed. The wave generated by the 1877 Iquique earthquake was approximately 10 meters high, about 33 feet, along 500 kilometers of coastline, from Arica in the north to Mejillones in the south. In Arica, 8 separate large waves were recorded. The water reached the cathedral, which sat well inland of the normal high water mark. A former United States Navy steamship, the USS Wateree, which had been beached far inland by a previous tsunami in 1868 and left there as essentially a permanent feature of the landscape, was lifted by the 1877 wave and moved several kilometers across the shoreline. The Wateree had been there for 9 years. It was moved again. The tsunami crossed the Pacific. It struck Japan. It struck Hawaii. It reached the Fijian Islands, where, by some accounts, the largest concentration of deaths from the entire event occurred. The historical record from that period is uneven, and the casualty figures vary across sources, but the overall pattern is clear. A great earthquake on the coast of northern Chile generated a Pacific-wide tsunami that killed people on 3 continents and across many island groups. Think about what that means for a moment. A coastline that is, geographically, about as far from Japan or Hawaii or Fiji as one place on the surface of this planet can be from another, generated a wave that crossed the entire Pacific Ocean basin and arrived on those distant shores with enough energy to kill people. The wave travelled at the speed of a commercial jet airliner, about 800 kilometers per hour in deep ocean, for roughly 22 hours, slowing as it climbed onto continental shelves and then surging upward as it ran into coastline. 22 hours is enough time for any modern tsunami warning system to alert every coastal population in the Pacific Basin. In 1877 there was no such system. the wave that left northern Chile at 16 minutes past 9 o'clock at night on the 9th of May arrived in Hawaii without anyone knowing it was coming. By the time word of the Chilean earthquake reached Hawaii via the limited telegraphic communications of the era, the wave had already done its damage. The same was true in Japan, in Fiji, in every other affected coastline. The dead were dead before anyone knew what had killed them. That is the kind of event the Iquique Gap is loaded for. That is what we are talking about when we talk about the corridor's potential. The 1877 earthquake ruptured a specific segment of the Peru-Chile subduction zone, between approximately 19 degrees south latitude and 21 degrees south. That segment, before 1877, had been silent for many decades. After 1877, the segment locked up again. The plates kept moving, the stress kept accumulating, and for the next 137 years, nothing significant happened on that exact segment. In 2005, a group of seismologists who had been studying the segment estimated that the recurrence interval for great earthquakes on this stretch of the Peru-Chile subduction zone was approximately 135 years. Their estimate was based on a combination of geological evidence from previous events and modern GPS measurements showing how fast the plates were accumulating strain. The implication of the estimate was that the segment was, by the early 21st century, approaching the timing of its next great rupture. The segment came to be known, in the seismological literature and in the broader scientific community, as the Iquique seismic gap. A gap, in this sense, is a region of a subduction zone where strain has been accumulating without major release for long enough that the absence of recent earthquakes is itself a signal. The Iquique Gap was, by the early 2010s, one of the most watched seismic gaps in the world. Seismologists from multiple countries had instrumented the corridor with GPS receivers, broadband seismometers, and ocean bottom pressure sensors. They were waiting for it to break. On the 1st of April 2014 it broke, mostly, sort of. The 2014 Iquique earthquake had a moment magnitude of 8.1 to 8.2, depending on which agency you ask. It was a great earthquake by any measure. It ruptured the northern portion of the 1877 gap. It generated a tsunami, although a smaller one than the 1877 event. It killed a small number of people, primarily through coastal damage in Iquique and surrounding towns. It was, from a scientific perspective, exactly the event that the gap had been expected to produce. Except for two things. First, the 2014 earthquake ruptured only about 200 kilometers of the 500-kilometer gap. It filled in the northern portion. It did not rupture the central or southern portions. Second, the 2014 earthquake was preceded by a foreshock sequence that, in retrospect, is one of the most remarkable foreshock sequences in modern seismological history. Beginning on the 16th of March, 2014, 16 days before the mainshock, a magnitude 6.7 event occurred 40 kilometers south of the eventual mainshock epicenter. Over the following 2 weeks, 3 additional events in the magnitude 6.2 to 6.4 range occurred. The foreshocks migrated northward, over approximately 50 kilometers, toward the location where the mainshock would eventually rupture. By the time the mainshock happened on April 1st, the foreshock sequence had essentially traced out the geographic outline of the impending rupture. The 2014 sequence was the first clear case, in instrumental history, of a megathrust earthquake with a well-documented foreshock sequence that could, in principle, have been used to provide warning. The warning would have been imperfect. Magnitude 6 earthquakes happen regularly in subduction zones without being followed by magnitude 8 earthquakes, so a real-time prediction system based on the foreshocks alone would have generated false alarms. But the pattern was there. The sequence preceded the mainshock. The slow slip event that accompanied the foreshocks, detected in the GPS data, showed that the locked patch was beginning to release in advance of the full rupture. This is the context in which the May 25th, 2026 event is being read. People who are paying attention to the Iquique Gap, who know about 1877 and 2014, are looking at the May 25th event and asking the obvious question. Is this a foreshock? Is this 2014 all over again, with the slab starting to talk before the boundary breaks? The answer, as best as the science can tell us right now, is no. We will get to why. But before we do, we need to look at what is left of the 1877 gap and why the answer matters. Part 9. The 300 kilometers nobody has slept easy about. The 1877 Iquique earthquake ruptured approximately 500 kilometers of subduction zone. The 2014 Iquique earthquake ruptured approximately 200 kilometers, filling in the northern portion of the original gap. That left approximately 300 kilometers of subduction zone unruptured between the 2014 northern bookend and a separate, earlier event that ruptured a southern bookend. The southern bookend was the July 30th, 1995 Antofagasta earthquake. It was a moment magnitude 8.0 to 8.1 event, ruptured at a depth of approximately 46 kilometers along the subduction interface, with a slip area of about 180 kilometers by 70 kilometers and a maximum slip of about 5.4 meters. It ruptured the southernmost portion of the 1877 gap, generating a small tsunami of 2 to 2.5 meters along the coastline from Mejillones to Tal Tal. It was a great earthquake by any measure, but it caused remarkably little damage given its size. Ground acceleration in Antofagasta reached only about 29% of gravity, which is moderate for an earthquake of this magnitude. So now we have the geometry. The 1877 gap, 500 kilometers long, was bookended at the north by the 2014 Iquique event, and at the south by the 1995 Antofagasta event. Together, those two events ruptured about 370 kilometers of the original gap. That leaves about 300 kilometers in the middle still unruptured. The unruptured central segment runs, approximately, from south of Iquique to north of Antofagasta, through the corridor that includes the cities of Tocopilla and Calama on the coast and inland. The unruptured segment is loaded. The plates are still moving at 9 centimeters per year. The strain has been accumulating, on average, since at least 1877, possibly longer if 1877 did not fully release older accumulated strain. As of 2026, the segment has been accumulating strain for 149 years without a great earthquake of its own. The 2014 and 1995 events relieved strain on the segments north and south of it, but did not significantly affect the central segment itself. To get a sense of how much strain has accumulated, do the basic arithmetic. If the plates move at 9 centimeters per year, and the central segment has been locked since 1877, then the segment has accumulated approximately 149 times 9 centimeters of theoretical strain. That is about 13.4 meters, or roughly 44 feet, of cumulative displacement that has not been released as movement on the interface. The actual stored strain may be less than this, because some fraction of the plate motion is accommodated by aseismic creep and slow slip, neither of which produce earthquakes. But the broad scale of the loading is on the order of meters, not centimeters. That is a lot of stored elastic energy in the rock. When the rock fails, that energy gets released in seconds. Some of it goes into shaking, some of it goes into permanent surface displacement. The coastline of northern Chile will literally move during the next great rupture, by potentially meters in some places. Some of it goes into the tsunami, and some of it gets dissipated as heat in the rock as the fault slips. The total energy involved is on the order of 10 to the 18th joules, gigatons of TNT equivalent, and it has all been put into the rock very slowly over the past century and a half by the continuous motion of the Nazca plate against the South American plate. In the scientific literature, the most cited paper on what this means is the Hayes et al.'s paper, published in the journal Nature in 2014, titled Continuing Megathrust Earthquake Potential in Chile After the 2014 Iquique Earthquake. The paper used the rupture geometry of the 2014 event and the existing strain accumulation models for the corridor to estimate what the unruptured central segment was capable of producing. The paper's conclusion was that the central segment, given the strain it has been carrying, is capable of producing a moment magnitude 8.5 earthquake on its own, and possibly larger if it ruptures together with one or both of the bookend segments. 8.5 is not a small earthquake. 8.5 is, in terms of energy release, approximately 100 times more powerful than the 2014 Iquique event, and approximately 1,000 times more powerful than the May 25, 2026 event. 8.5 is in the range of the original 1877 mainshock. If the central segment ruptures, alone, with no involvement of the bookend segments, it will be a magnitude approaching 8.5 and will generate a tsunami that crosses the Pacific. To put the energy difference in concrete terms, consider what 1,000 times the energy of the May 25th event would do at the surface. The May 25th event released the energy of about 25 megatons of TNT. 1,000 times that is 25 gigatons. 25 gigatons is approximately 500 times the yield of the largest nuclear weapon ever tested. It is approximately 10,000 times the yield of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. It is, in absolute energy terms, the kind of energy release that the human imagination has trouble holding. And yet it is the kind of event that the 1877 Quake earthquake produced, and the kind of event that the central segment of the Quake gap is currently loaded for. The energy is real. The plate motion has been adding to it, at 9 centimeters per year, for 149 years. The strain is somewhere in the rock above the slab, waiting to be released. We cannot see it. We can measure parts of it with GPS receivers placed on the surface. We can model parts of it with elastic stress calculations, but we cannot, with any current technology, know exactly when the rock will fail. We only know that the energy is there, and that the rock cannot hold it forever. That is the loaded clock that sits above the depth where the May 25th event happened. The May 25th event was inside the slab. The loaded segment is on the interface, above the slab. The two are geometrically separated by about 60 kilometers of depth. They are different surfaces. They are different physical phenomena, but they are in the same geographic corridor, and the slab below is in the same general state of compression that drives the loading of the interface above. The geometric picture is worth holding in your mind. Imagine a ramp tilted at about 30 degrees. The ramp is the top surface of the Nazca plate as it descends beneath the South American continent. The interface, the contact between the Nazca plate and the South American plate above it, runs along the top of the ramp. At the shallowest depths near the trench, the interface is at about 10 kilometers below the seafloor. As you move eastward along the ramp, the interface deepens, at 20 kilometers depth, then 30, then 40, then 50. By about 50 kilometers depth, the interface ceases to be seismogenic. The rock is hot enough that it deforms by slow flow rather than fracturing. The locked zone, where great earthquakes happen, is the segment of the interface between roughly 10 and 50 kilometers depth. The interface above this segment is too cold for steady slip, and so it builds elastic strain that is eventually released in earthquakes. The May 25th event happened 60 kilometers below this locked zone, inside the slab itself, not at the interface. To the seismologists watching the corridor, the May 25th event and the locked zone above it are two different things in two different geometric positions, and the connection between them is much weaker than the connection between two different parts of the locked zone itself. The question that any honest video on this event has to ask is whether the May 25th event tells us anything about when the central segment is going to rupture. The literature on stress transfer between intraslab and interplate events is, to put it generously, unsettled. Some papers suggest that intraslab events can subtly change the loading on the interface above. Other papers find no detectable effect. The general consensus is that whatever the effect is, it is small, much smaller than the stress changes the interface generates on itself by continuing to accumulate strain at 9 centimeters per year. So the honest answer is probably not significantly. The May 25th event did not, by any measure we have, advance the rupture of the central Quake gap segment in any meaningful way. The segment is still loaded, the strain is still accumulating, the timing of the next great event is still, as far as we can tell, governed by the long-term plate motion and the long-term strain accumulation, not by individual intraslab ruptures 60 kilometers below. But that does not mean the May 25th event is meaningless in the context of the gap. It is a reminder. It is a reminder that the slab below the gap is alive, is breaking itself on a regular basis, and is part of the same overall system that is loading the gap. The gap is not a quiet feature of the landscape. The gap is the silent surface above a slab that is, internally, anything but silent, and the gap will eventually break. The question is not whether but when. The when is not knowable from the May 25th event. The when is probably also not knowable from any single observable signal until the foreshock sequence begins, the way it did in 2014, 16 days before the main shock. When the next Great Akiki earthquake comes, it will probably be preceded by something the seismologists can recognize. The May 25th event was not that something. The May 25th event was deeper and on a different surface, and the wrong kind of earthquake to be that something. The next foreshock sequence, when it begins, will look more like the March 2014 sequence. moderate magnitude events on the interface itself, migrating geographically across the locked patch, accompanied by detectable slow slip in the GPS data. That is the signature that the corridor's seismologists are watching for. The May 25th event does not have that signature. It is something else, something that, in any reasonable reading, is part of the slab's regular self-maintenance, not the prelude to the gap's full release. What the corridor's seismologists actually do on a day-to-day basis is run a set of automated detection systems on the delta streaming from their GPS receivers and broadband seismometers. The GPS receivers, placed on the surface, measure their own position to a precision of a few millimeters. If the surface moves slowly, over hours or days, in a way that is not associated with any shaking, the GPS detects it and the detection systems flag it as a possible slow slip event. The broadband seismometers, placed across the corridor at intervals of tens to hundreds of kilometers, listen for small earthquakes that fall below the threshold of human perception, but are clearly visible in the instrumental record. When a small earthquake happens, the automated systems triangulate its location, calculate its magnitude, and add it to the catalogue. Over time, the catalogue builds up a record of how the corridor is behaving. Researchers then look at that record for patterns. They look for clusters of events that might indicate a single underlying process. They look for changes in the depth distribution that might signal a shift in stress state. They look for migrations of activity from one location to another that might indicate something is moving. Most of what they find is noise. The corridor is, after all, an active subduction zone, and active subduction zones generate a constant low-level background of small earthquakes that does not, by itself, indicate anything specific is about to happen. The trick is distinguishing the noise from the signal, and that distinction is one of the hardest problems in modern seismology. That distinction is what the next part is about, because the question, is this a foreshock, is the question everyone is asking, and the question deserves a careful answer. Part 10. Is this a foreshock? A foreshock in the technical sense is an earthquake that precedes a larger earthquake on the same fault, in the same general location, within a relatively short time frame, typically days to weeks, occasionally months. The defining characteristic of a foreshock is that, in retrospect, it is identifiable as part of the same rupture sequence as the eventual mainshock. The earthquake itself is not labelled as a foreshock at the time it happens, because at the time it happens nobody knows whether a larger event will follow. The label is applied only after the mainshock occurs and seismologists look backward at the catalogue. The 2014 Quake foreshock sequence is the classic modern example. The March 16th magnitude 6.7 event at the time was a notable but unremarkable earthquake in a known seismic gap. It was not labelled a foreshock. The 3 additional magnitude 6 events that followed it over the next 2 weeks were similarly not labelled as foreshocks in real time. Only after the April 1st mainshock occurred did seismologists look back at the sequence and recognise what they had been watching. The foreshocks, in retrospect, had migrated geographically toward the eventual mainshock epicentre, with the migration tracing out the future rupture geometry. The slow slip event detected in the GPS data, which the Risatalon paper in Science documented in detail in the months after the earthquake, showed that the locked patch was beginning to release in advance of the full rupture. The foreshocks were the surface signature of a process that was, fundamentally, the early stages of the mainshock itself. Could the May 25th, 2026 event be the beginning of a similar sequence? Could the next several days or weeks bring additional moderate magnitude events on the interface, migrating geographically across the unruptured central segment, leading eventually to an 8-point-something rupture of the gap? The honest answer, based on what we know about the May 25th event, is almost certainly not. But with the important caveat that this kind of pattern, recognition is only reliable in retrospect, and the absence of clear foreshock signatures from past events is part of why predictive seismology remains so difficult. The reasons to think it is not a foreshock are several. First, the May 25th event was at 101 kilometers depth, inside the slab, on what we call an intraslab fault. The 2014 foreshock sequence was on the interface, at depths between roughly 20 and 40 kilometers. These are different surfaces. They are physically separated by approximately 60 kilometers of rock. They are driven by different stress states. An intraslab event is not, in any well-documented case, the start of a megathrust foreshock sequence. The events that precede great megathrust earthquakes tend to be on the interface itself, not deeper inside the slab. Second, the focal mechanism of the May 25th event was consistent with normal intraslab slab stretching, not with interface thrusting. The fault plane that ruptured was oriented to accommodate the slab's internal extensional stresses. A foreshock on the interface would have a thrust mechanism, with the slab moving downward and the continent above moving upward and seaward. The May 25th event did not have that signature. Third, the aftershock sequence so far has stayed at intermediate depths. The largest aftershocks have been deeper than the main shock, not shallower, indicating slab internal reorganization rather than rupture migration toward the interface. A real foreshock sequence ahead of a megathrust rupture would, by the 2014 precedent, generate aftershocks that migrate upward and laterally along the interface itself. Fourth, there is no detected slow slip event in the available GPS data that would correspond to the May 25th event. Slow slip events, which are slow motion on faults that releases strain without generating noticeable shaking, often accompany the foreshock sequences that precede great megathrust earthquakes. The 2014 sequence had a clear slow slip signal. The May 25th event does not, based on the GPS data available in the days after the event. For all of these reasons, the May 25th event does not match the profile of a megathrust foreshock. It matches the profile of a normal intraslab event in a corridor that produces normal intraslab events every few years. But the caveat matters. Predictive seismology is hard. The number of megathrust earthquakes for which we have well-documented foreshock sequences is very small. 2014 Quake is one of the few clear cases. The number of intraslab events that occurred in the corridor of a future megathrust earthquake without being followed by anything dramatic is much larger. The base rate for an intraslab event in the Quake corridor that precedes a megathrust by hours, days, or weeks is, based on the historical record, very low. Most intraslab events in this corridor are followed by nothing in particular. A few have been followed by interesting interface activity over the following years, but the connection is statistically weak. So the answer is no. This is almost certainly not a foreshock for a megathrust earthquake on the Quake gap. The almost is doing some work in that sentence, because predictive seismology is uncertain enough that absolute statements are not warranted. But the probabilistic answer is clear. The May 25th event is not a foreshock for the gap. It is an intraslab event. The gap is still loaded. The next great event on the gap, when it comes, will probably look like 2014. Interface foreshocks, slow slip, geographic migration on the interface. And the May 25th event does not have any of those characteristics. There is, however, an interesting wrinkle in the foreshock literature that is worth mentioning briefly. A number of papers published since the 2014 event have looked at whether intraslab activity in the years before a megathrust earthquake might be elevated in subtle ways that only become apparent in retrospect. The studies are mixed. Some find weak signals of elevated intraslab activity in the months to years before great megathrust events. Others find no signal at all. The strongest claim in the literature, which is itself controversial, is that the slab and the interface communicate through complex stress transfer paths, and that the slab's behavior is, in some sense, a noisy early indicator of the interface's state. The weakest claim, which is more widely accepted, is that the connection is too noisy to be useful for prediction, even when it might be detectable in retrospect. Neither claim suggests that any single intraslab event, even one as large as the May 25th 6.9, is a reliable precursor to anything specific. The most one can say is that the slab activity in the corridor over the past few years has been consistent with a system that is under stress, which is also what one would say about any active subduction zone, including ones where no great earthquake is imminent. The corridor's seismologists are still watching. The strain is still accumulating. The clock is still ticking. May 25th was not the alarm. It was the slab doing what the slab does. Part 11. The other stories everyone asked about. In the hours after the main shock, several alternative explanations for the May 25th event began circulating on social media. Most of them are familiar. They have circulated after every major earthquake on this channel's coverage for the past several years, and we have addressed them before. But because the audience watching this particular video may not have seen all of those previous discussions, and because the volume of the conversation around this particular event has been substantial, it is worth running through the main alternative claims and dismantling each one carefully. The first alternative claim is that the May 25th event was caused by solar activity. The Sun, on May 25th, had a moderately active disk. The Space Weather Prediction Center logged an ongoing S1 solar radiation storm, meaning the greater than 10 MeV proton flux at geosynchronous orbit had exceeded the S1 threshold of 10 particles per square centimetre per second per steradian. The peak flux of about 23.79 particles per square centimetre per second per steradian on the GOS feed was reached at approximately 10 minutes past 1 o'clock UTC on the morning of May 26th. A partial halo coronal mass ejection had been observed in the LASCO C2 chronograph at 12 minutes past 10 o'clock UTC on the evening of May 25th, originating from beyond the northwest limb of the visible solar disk. 3 Type 2 radio emission alerts were issued by SWPC at 19:20 and 22 minutes past 2 o'clock UTC on the afternoon of May 26th, indicating shock-driven coronal mass ejection activity from active regions on or just beyond the visible disk. These are real solar phenomena. They happened, but they did not cause the earthquake. The reasons are several. First, the energy budget. The peak energy of solar particles arriving at Earth during an S1 storm is on the order of 10 to the 20th joules total, spread over the entire planet's atmosphere and magnetosphere over many hours. The earthquake released approximately 10 to the 14th joules in a few seconds, focused at 100 kilometers depth inside the slab. For the solar particles to have triggered the earthquake, some mechanism would need to transmit a meaningful fraction of that solar energy through the atmosphere, through the crust, into the slab at 100 kilometers depth, in a form that could trigger rupture. No such mechanism has been demonstrated. Second, the geomagnetic field on May 25th was quiet. The KP index, which measures geomagnetic disturbance, peaked at 2.67 over the 24-hour period preceding the earthquake, well below the threshold for any geomagnetic storm. The Marchitelli et al. Paper, published in Scientific Reports in 2020, is the most cited recent attempt to find a statistical correlation between solar activity and earthquakes. That paper found a weak correlation, statistically detectable but not interpretable as a causal mechanism, and the correlation was strongest under disturbed geomagnetic conditions, which did not exist on May 25th. The Mizuno, Kao, and Umino paper, published in 2026, specifically tested the capacitive coupling hypothesis, one of the proposed mechanisms for solar seismic correlation, and disconfirmed it for quiet geomagnetic conditions. The conditions on May 25th were exactly the conditions under which even the most generous solar seismic mechanism does not predict an effect. So the solar triggering claim fails on energy grounds and on mechanism grounds. The Sun was active, the slab broke itself, and the two were coincident in time but not causally connected. The second alternative claim is that the earthquake was triggered by HAARP, the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, an ionospheric research facility in Alaska. HAARP, when operating at full power, transmits approximately 3.6 megawatts of radio energy into the ionosphere. The energy released by the May 25th earthquake was approximately 10 to the 14th joules. The ratio between 3.6 megawatts continuous output and 10 to the 14th joules of impulsive energy release is on the order of 15 orders of magnitude. For HAARP to have triggered the earthquake, the ionospheric heating would need to couple through some unknown mechanism into the slab at 100 kilometers depth, with an energy amplification of a quadrillion or more. No physics supports any such coupling. The claim fails on basic energy budget grounds. The third alternative claim is that the earthquake was an underground nuclear test conducted by some unspecified actor. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization operates the International Monitoring System, which is a global network of seismic, hydroacoustic, infrasound, and radionuclide stations specifically designed to discriminate between earthquakes and nuclear explosions. The seismic waveform signature of an earthquake, particularly an intermediate-depth intraslab event with the characteristic double seismic zone geometry of northern Chile, is forensically distinguishable from any nuclear explosion. The depth alone makes the nuclear test claim physically impossible. The deepest underground nuclear test ever conducted reached depths of a few kilometers. The earthquake on May 25th was at 101 kilometers depth, more than 20 times deeper than any test ever conducted. There is no engineering capability anywhere in the world to place a nuclear device at that depth and detonate it. The the claim fails on physical impossibility grounds. The fourth alternative claim is the magnitude suppression claim, which we addressed earlier. The argument is that the actual magnitude was much larger than reported, and that the official agencies are coordinating to downplay it. The argument fails because 4 independent agencies, USGS, EMSC, PTWC, and Chile's own CSN, converged on the same magnitude using independent station networks and independent processing methods. The raw seismic waveforms are publicly available on global station servers, and any independent researcher with the appropriate training can verify the magnitude calculation. None have published corrections. The fifth alternative claim, which is the most plausible sounding, and therefore the one that deserves the most careful handling, is that the May 25th event signals the imminent arrival of the long-expected great earthquake on the Quake Gap. We addressed this in the previous part. The short version is that the May 25th event is the wrong kind of earthquake to be a foreshock for the gap. Intraslab events at 100 kilometers depth do not, in any well-documented case, precede great megathrust events on the interface above. The corridor is loaded, the next great event is geologically inevitable on geological timescales, but a specific prediction that the next megathrust will occur within hours, days, or weeks because of the May 25th event is not supported by the evidence we have. A sixth claim, which is worth flagging only because it has been circulating in some specific online communities, is that the entire 1877 event was misattributed, and that the magnitude was much smaller than the 8.5 to 8.8 conventionally cited. A paper published in 2022 in the Journal of South American Earth Sciences by Vinny and Klein argued, on the basis of a careful rereading of historical sources, that the 1877 event might have been substantially smaller than the conventional estimate, possibly closer to a magnitude 8.0 rather than 8.5 to 8.8. This is a real scientific argument made by serious researchers, not a conspiracy claim. It does not, however, change the broader picture. Even if 1877 was smaller than conventionally estimated, the corridor has still been silent on the interface for 149 years, and the strain accumulation continues regardless of the precise magnitude of the previous rupture. The Vinny-Klein revision, if it holds up, would mean the corridor is loaded for a slightly smaller next rupture than previously assumed, perhaps magnitude 8.0 rather than 8.5, but the basic point that the corridor is loaded remains. The science here is contested at the margins, but the general picture is robust. These alternative claims are easy to engage with because they are familiar. They cycle through after every major earthquake. They are mostly wrong for the same reasons they were wrong the last time. The honest engagement is to take them seriously enough to dismantle them, but not so seriously that they crowd out the actual scientific story, which is interesting enough on its own merits. The actual story is that the slab broke. The slab broke in a way that is consistent with how the slab breaks. The slab broke above a corridor that is loaded for something much larger. The slab breaking does not advance the larger event, but the slab breaking does remind us that the corridor is active and is being watched, and will eventually produce the larger event when it is ready. That is the story, and that is the story we are going to spend the rest of this video on. One final note on the conspiracy claims before we move forward. Most of these alternative explanations are not generated by people who have studied the physics of subduction zones, or the engineering of warning systems, or the statistics of fault loading. They are generated by people who see a dramatic event, observe that the official explanation requires technical knowledge to understand and substitute a simpler narrative that they find more satisfying. The simpler narrative is almost always wrong, because the universe is, frankly, more complicated than the simpler narrative allows. But the impulse behind the simpler narrative is human and recognizable, and the right response to it is not contempt, but patience. The honest engagement with these claims is to walk through the actual physics, the actual data, and the actual reasoning, and to do so respectfully enough that the people generating the claims feel heard rather than dismissed. That is what we have tried to do in this section. Whether we have succeeded depends on the reader, or rather on the listener, and on whether they came to this video looking for confirmation of what they already believed, or looking for a better understanding of what actually happened. The latter is what this channel is for. The former is not. Part 12. How to read a subduction zone. There are 3 ways to read what happened on May 25th, and each of them is correct depending on what question you're asking. The first reading is the routine reading. The May 25th event was a magnitude 6.9 intraslab earthquake in a corridor that produces magnitude 6 and larger intraslab earthquakes every few years. The aftershock sequence is decaying within normal parameters. The damage was light to moderate, the population impact was inconvenient but not catastrophic, and the surface impact has already faded from the global news cycle. From this reading, the May 25th event is one of many that the Nazca slab produces, and there is nothing to extrapolate from it. The slab is doing what the slab does. The corridor's seismologists logged the event in their catalogue, refined their models slightly, and moved on. The audience that watched the magnitude number tick upward in real time got a brief window into how seismology operates, and then went back to whatever they were doing before. End of story. This reading is, on most days, correct. It is the reading that fits the largest fraction of similar events. It is the reading that, statistically, has the highest probability of being the most useful framing for understanding what just happened. The second reading is the regional stress reading. The May 25th event occurred in a corridor that has produced a cluster of moderate magnitude activity over the preceding 30 days. The aftershock sequence is decaying deeper into the slab rather than upward, suggesting that the slab is reorganizing its internal stress state along its own geometry. The fact that the corridor's intraslab seismicity is anomalously concentrated compared to other global subduction zones, the 80 to 150 kilometer band of intense activity that does not appear with the same intensity elsewhere, suggests that this slab is under stresses that other slabs are not under, or is failing in ways that other slabs do not fail. The May 25th event in this reading is not a freak occurrence, but is part of a regional stress signature that has been building for some time and that may continue to produce events of similar magnitude in the coming months. The corridor is, in this reading, talking. Not predicting any specific future event, but indicating that something is happening at depth that is worth continuing to monitor. This reading is, on some days, also correct. It is the reading that the most careful seismologists working on the corridor probably hold privately, even as they publicly emphasize the routine nature of the event. The corridor's stress state is not normal. The slab is not behaving the way slabs in other subduction zones behave. Something is going on at depth, and the May 25th event is part of that something. The third reading is the broad precursor reading. The Quake seismic gap has been silent for 149 years. It is loaded for a magnitude 8.5 or larger megathrust earthquake. The May 25th event occurred in the same geographic corridor, 60 kilometers below the locked interface. The connection between the intraslab and interplate seismicity is unsettled in the scientific literature, but is not zero. The May 25th event in this reading is not the foreshock, but it is a reminder, a kind of geological signal, that the system above is loaded and that the system below is active. The reading does not predict any specific timing for the next great event, but it does suggest that the audience should not forget about the Quake gap, and that the corridor's silence on the interface is itself a signal worth paying attention to. There is also a sub-reading worth mentioning, which is the historical pattern reading. If you look at the catalogue of large intraslab events in northern Chile over the past several decades, you can see a pattern. Intraslab events at intermediate depths happen in this corridor every few years. Some of them precede great interplate events by years. Some of them follow great interplate events by years. Some of them happen in periods when no great interplate event is anywhere on the horizon. The pattern is, frankly, ambiguous. The intraslab catalogue is consistent with a corridor that is, in some long-term sense, under stress, but the catalogue does not lend itself to short-term predictions. If you tried to use the intraslab catalogue to predict the timing of the next great Quake earthquake, you would fail. The catalogue is too noisy, the connection between intraslab and interplate is too weak, and the human timescales we operate on are too short relative to the geological timescales on which the system loads. But the catalogue is still useful in a broader sense. It tells us that the corridor is active. It tells us that the slab below is not asleep, and it tells us that, on any given week or month or year, the corridor is more likely to produce something interesting than a randomly chosen subduction zone elsewhere on the planet. The May 25th event is one entry in that catalogue. It is consistent with what the catalogue has been showing for decades, and that consistency is, itself, a kind of signal, not a prediction, but a baseline expectation that the corridor will keep doing what the corridor does. This reading is also, in a sense, correct. The Quake gap is real. It is loaded. The next great event is geologically inevitable. The May 25th event happened in the corridor of that loaded gap. The reading does not require any specific prediction to be useful. It just requires us to keep the broader context in mind, to remember that the corridor is not a quiet feature of the world, and to keep paying attention. The middle reading is the most defensible. The routine reading is the most likely. The broad precursor reading is the most viral. The honest answer is that all three are partially true at the same time, and the relative weight of each depends on what question you're asking and what time frame you're operating on. If you live in Calama and you want to know whether you should be packing your car and driving away, the answer is no. The May 25th event was not the start of a megathrust rupture sequence. The aftershocks are decaying normally. The probability of a much larger event in the next several days is low. You should, of course, continue to maintain the kind of emergency preparedness that anyone living above the Peruchile subduction zone should maintain. Water, food, flashlight, a plan, but you should not pack your car. If you are a seismologist working on the corridor, the answer is that you continue to monitor the GPS data, the interface seismicity, and any slow slip signals. You wait for the kind of pattern that 2014 showed, moderate magnitude interface events migrating geographically, accompanied by slow slip. If you see that pattern, you act on it. If you do not see that pattern, you continue to wait. The May 25th event does not change your monitoring posture in any significant way. If you are a viewer of this channel, the answer is that the corridor is worth remembering. The Quake gap is loaded. The next great event is coming, on geological timescales. We do not know when. We do not know exactly where within the loaded segment the rupture will initiate. We do not know how the rupture will propagate or how large the eventual magnitude will be. But the event is, in some functional sense, on the schedule. And the May 25th event was a small reminder of that schedule. Not because the small event predicts the large one, but because the small event happened in the corridor where the large one is loaded, and the geographic coincidence is worth carrying in your mind. The three readings also help with a common confusion in how earthquake coverage gets framed. Coverage tends to either overclaim, "This is the foreshock to the big one, here are the signs," or underclaim, "Nothing to see here, just a normal earthquake." Neither framing is quite right. The overclaim framing assumes a level of predictive certainty that the science does not support. The underclaim framing dismisses geographic and historical context that is, in fact, relevant for understanding why a particular event is being talked about. The honest framing is the one that holds the three readings simultaneously, that acknowledges what we do not know, and that resists the temptation to either alarm or dismiss. The May 25th event is, in the routine reading, one of many. In the regional stress reading, part of an ongoing pattern that is worth continuing to monitor. In the broad precursor reading, a reminder of the loaded corridor above. All three are partially true. None is the whole truth. And the whole truth, on most days, is that the slab keeps moving, the strain keeps accumulating, the clock keeps ticking, and we keep watching. That is how to read a subduction zone, with multiple readings held simultaneously, with humility about what we know and what we do not, with patience for the long time scales on which the system operates, and with a kind of attentiveness to the small signals, the slab breaking itself, the aftershocks migrating in unexpected directions, the magnitude number ticking upward in real time. That is the only honest way to engage with a planet that operates on schedules vastly longer than any single human life. Part 13. The continent that will not sit still. There is a satellite image of the western coast of South America that, if you have not seen it, you should look up after this video. The image is a topographic relief map color-coded by elevation, showing the contrast between the abyssal Pacific Ocean to the west and the soaring Andes to the east, with the narrow strip of the Atacama Desert pinned between them. The contrast is visually almost unbelievable. The ocean floor west of the coast plunges to depths of more than 8,000 meters in the Peru-Chile Trench. The mountains east of the coast rise to elevations of more than 6,000 meters in the Andean peaks of central Chile and Bolivia and Argentina. The vertical difference between the bottom of the trench and the top of the highest peaks is more than 14 kilometers, more than 50,000 feet, almost twice the elevation of Mount Everest above sea level. That vertical difference is what the Nazca plate has been building by colliding with the South American plate for the better part of the past 200 million years. The plate goes down, the continent goes up. Every centimetre of horizontal motion that the South American plate cannot accomplish, because the Nazca plate is in the way, has been accommodated vertically. The Andes are the receipt for the entire history of this collision. The trench is the receipt for the diving plate. Together they form one of the most pronounced topographic features on the planet, and they are both the products of the same continuous process. The process is still going on. The Nazca plate is still diving at 9 centimetres per year in northern Chile. The South American plate is still being pushed westward by the spreading of the mid-Atlantic ridge. The Andes are still rising at approximately 10 millimetres per year. The trench is still deepening. The slab is still breaking itself every few years at intermediate depths in the corridor we have been talking about. And the interface between the slab and the continent above it is still locked in the segment between the 2014 Iquique earthquake and the 1995 Antofagasta earthquake, still accumulating strain at 9 centimetres per year, still loaded for an eventual magnitude 8.5 or larger great earthquake, whose timing nobody can predict but whose arrival is, on geological timescales, a certainty. The thumbnail on this video says, "South America is moving." That is not a metaphor. South America is, literally, moving. It is moving westward at about 2.5 centimetres per year as the Atlantic spreading pushes it. It is being shoved up by the Nazca plate at the western edge by another 2.5 centimetres per year of forced vertical motion. It is rising, it is being crumpled, and every so often the rock that is doing the crumpling, the slab beneath the continent, the interface where the slab meets the continent, gives way in a moment, in a few seconds, in an earthquake that releases years or decades or centuries of accumulated strain. May 25th, 2026 was one of those moments. A small one. A moment in the slab's regular ongoing self-maintenance. The slab released about 25 megatons of energy in a few seconds, killed nobody, injured nobody, cut the power to 22,000 homes in a copper mining town that was prepared for exactly this, and then settled back into the background pattern of subduction zone activity that has been operating in this corridor since before the human species existed. The next moment will, eventually, be much larger. The corridor has been silent on the interface for 149 years. The strain has been accumulating. The 2014 Iquique earthquake filled the northern bookend. The 1995 Antofagasta earthquake filled the southern bookend. The middle is still loaded. When the middle releases, the release will be of a magnitude that we have not seen on this corridor since 1877. It will probably be preceded by a foreshock sequence on the interface, something like the 2014 pattern, but in the corridor between the 2014 and 1995 rupture zones. The foreshocks will be moderate magnitude events. They will migrate geographically. The GPS data will show slow slip on the interface. The seismologists will recognize the pattern, possibly hours or days in advance, possibly only in retrospect. The warning, when it comes, will be imperfect. The release, when it comes, will probably generate a tsunami that crosses the Pacific. The wave will arrive in Japan, in Hawaii, in the Marquesas, in New Zealand, in the Aleutians, in places thousands of miles from the rupture, hours after the rupture itself. The wave will be smaller than the 1877 wave, probably, because the 1877 event ruptured a longer segment of the boundary. But it will still be a significant wave. It will still kill people in places nobody alive in northern Chile has ever visited. It will still write itself into the historical record of the Pacific. The May 25th event was not that event. The May 25th event was the slab, doing what the slab does. The slab is still doing it. The slab will keep doing it every day until the next great Iquique earthquake and after the next great Iquique earthquake, and for as long as the Nazca plate keeps moving eastward and the South American plate keeps moving westward and the Andes keep rising and the trench keeps deepening and the planet keeps turning. There is something deeply strange about living on top of a system like this. The system is, on human timescales, mostly invisible. The Andes do not visibly rise. The slab does not visibly dive. The interface does not visibly accumulate strain. The clock does not visibly tick. For most of the people who live in Calama and along the Antofagasta coast, the May 25th event was a brief interruption. The lights went out, the water stopped, the news arrived, the news passed, the lights came back on, the water came back on, life continued. The deep mechanism behind the interruption was invisible. The slab broke itself 60 miles down, but nobody saw the break. Nobody could see the break. The break was inside the planet, and the planet doesn't open up for inspection. There is something almost poetic about that invisibility. The largest tectonic force shaping the western coast of South America is, also, the least visible. The slab does its work in the dark, 60 miles down, where no sunlight has ever reached and no human eye has ever looked. The earthquake is the only moment when the slab makes itself heard, and even then the hearing is indirect. Seismic waves, magnitude calculations, depth solutions, interface models. We do not perceive the slab itself, we perceive its echoes. The May 25th event was an echo. The next great event will be another echo, much louder, harder to ignore. Between echoes, the slab does what it does, in silence, beneath us all. But the break left a signal. The signal was the shaking that arrived at the surface, the magnitude number that drifted upward over the first hour, the tsunami warning that flashed and then cleared, the aftershocks that went deeper instead of shallower, the geographic location that projected upward to a corridor that has been silent since 1877. The signal is the kind of thing that the people who pay attention to subduction zones for a living spend their careers learning how to read. The signal is, on May 25th, telling us that the slab is alive, the corridor is loaded, the clock is ticking, and the next moment in this very long process is still ahead of us, somewhere out in the future, on a date that nobody can yet predict. South America is moving, the continent that you can see in photographs, the mountain range that towers above the desert that pins itself between the mountains and the ocean. All of it is moving. The slab below it is moving. The plate to the west of it is moving. The interface between them is loading, slowly, continuously, at 9 centimeters per year. And every so often, in a moment that nobody can predict but everybody can recognize, after the fact the system releases what it has been holding, and the people who live on top of it remember again what they have always known, which is that the ground they walk on is not stable, and was never stable, and never will be. Consider the deep history of this corridor for a moment. The Nazca plate was not always the Nazca plate. The original Farallon plate, of which the Nazca is a remnant, was a much larger plate that floored most of the eastern Pacific Ocean tens of millions of years ago. As the Atlantic Ocean opened and South America was pushed westward, the Farallon plate was progressively consumed at the subduction zones along the western Americas. By about 23 million years ago, the Farallon plate had fragmented into several smaller plates, one of which is the Nazca plate we are now talking about, and another of which is the Cocos plate, which subducts beneath Central America. The Nazca plate is, in some sense, the surviving fragment of an ocean basin that no longer fully exists. It is being consumed at its eastern edge, where it dives into the Peruchila Trench faster than it is being created at its western edge, where new oceanic crust is added at the East Pacific rise. The plate is, on geological timescales, shrinking. Eventually, in tens of millions of years, the Nazca plate will be fully subducted. The Peruchila Trench will close, the Andes will eventually stop rising, and the entire system that has been generating Chilean earthquakes for hundreds of millions of years will come to an end. But not for a long time. Not in any timescale that matters to any human being living today, or to any human being who will ever live, or possibly even to the human species as it currently exists. The slab will keep moving for as long as our species is around to watch it. Within that deep time context, the May 25th event is a single tick of an enormous clock. The clock has been ticking since long before our species existed, and it will continue ticking for a long time after our species, in some form or another, has stopped paying attention. But for the brief window in which we are paying attention, the ticks are visible. They are recorded by seismographs. They are calculated by computers. They are added to catalogues. They are written into the historical record, which is itself a kind of consciousness that the planet has, indirectly, through us. We are the planet's witness, and the seismographic record is the planet's diary, and the May 25th event is one entry in that diary. An entry that will be read by seismologists in 50 years or 100 years, alongside many other entries, and used to refine our understanding of what the slab below northern Chile is doing and what it might do next. There is finally something to say about the relationship between the slow geological processes that drive subduction zone earthquakes and the fast human processes that we use to observe them. The slab moves at 9 centimeters per year. That is the speed at which the entire system loads. The earthquake, when it happens, is the release of that loading, and it happens at the speed of seismic waves, about 6 kilometers per second for the fastest waves. The ratio between the slow loading and the fast release is staggering. The system spends 149 years winding up and unwinds in a few seconds. The geological clock and the human clock are operating on completely different scales, and the moment of release is when the two scales briefly come into contact. For everyone else, the system is invisible. The centimeters per year are too slow to feel, the strain in the rock is too deep to measure directly, the interface is too inaccessible to instrument. The earthquake, when it comes, is the only moment when the system makes itself known on a timescale that humans can perceive. And then it goes quiet again, and the loading resumes, and the next release waits, for years, or decades, or centuries. That is the relationship the people of northern Chile have with the slab below them. The slab is, most of the time, completely invisible. It is the rock beneath the desert floor 60 miles down where no one will ever go. The slab makes itself known only through the events it generates. The earthquakes, the tsunamis, the slow uplift of the mountains, the slow down warp of the coast. The slab is, in a real sense, the largest invisible force in the daily lives of the people who live on top of it. It is the reason their cities exist where they do, the reason the copper mines exist where they do, the reason the desert is high and the ocean is deep and the mountains tower above both. And on May 25th, the slab made itself briefly visible. The shaking arrived at the surface, the lights went out, the water main broke, the seismographs around the world recorded the event, the agencies issued their warnings and then cleared them. The aftershocks decayed deeper into the slab, and then, within hours, the slab went quiet again, and the people who live on top of it went back to their lives, and the long, slow, invisible process of loading the system for the next release continued at 9 centimeters per year, the way it has been continuing for as long as anyone can remember, and the way it will continue for as long as anyone can foresee. The May 25th event was a reminder, not a warning, not a prediction, a reminder. The slab is still there, the corridor is still loaded, the next moment is still coming, and when it comes, the people watching this channel, and the people who have been watching the Quake gap for 149 years, will finally see what the silence has been waiting on. There is a phrase that gets used a lot in seismology circles when people talk about gaps like this. The phrase is, the question is not if, but when. The phrase is often dismissed as a cliché by people who have heard it too many times, but the cliché is, in this case, an accurate statement of what we actually know. The next great earthquake on the Quake Gap is geologically inevitable. The plates are moving, the strain is accumulating, the interface cannot hold the strain forever. At some point the rock will fail, and the failure will release the strain, and the release will generate an earthquake of a magnitude proportional to the accumulated strain. We do not know when that will be. We do not know exactly where the rupture will initiate. We do not know how the rupture will propagate, or whether it will involve only the central segment, or whether it will jump across to involve the bookend segments as well, producing a much larger event. We do not know any of those things, but we know that the event is, in some functional sense, on the schedule, and we know that the schedule is set by physical processes that we can observe, measure, and partially model. The unknowns are large, the knowns are also large. The known is the geometry, the rate of plate motion, the depth of the seismogenic zone, the history of past events, the size of the current loaded segment, the orientation of the stress field, the engineering codes of the cities above, the warning systems on the coast, the evacuation plans of the populations at risk. The unknown is the specific timing of the next release. The known is, in many ways, more important than the unknown, because the known is what determines the response when the unknown finally happens. When the great earthquake comes, the buildings of Calama and Antofagasta and Iquique will either hold or they will not, and the deciding factor will not be the magnitude of the earthquake, which will be roughly predictable from the geometry of the locked segment, but the quality of the engineering codes that were enforced when the buildings were built. The deciding factor for the coastal populations will not be the size of the tsunami, which will also be roughly predictable, but the speed and clarity of the warning, and the existence of evacuation routes, and the awareness of the population about what to do when the ground starts shaking. The known matters more than the unknown, because the known is what we can actually act on. Chile has been acting on the known for a long time. The country has, over the course of the past several decades, become one of the most seismically prepared nations on Earth. The construction codes are strict. The tsunami warning systems are integrated with the global networks. The schoolchildren are taught what to do when they feel shaking. The coastal towns have evacuation routes marked on signs. The mining infrastructure is designed to withstand ground accelerations far beyond what most other countries would consider necessary. None of this preparation will prevent the next Great Quake earthquake from causing damage, but it will, by all available evidence, dramatically reduce the death toll relative to what an equivalent earthquake would cause in a country that was less prepared. The 1877 earthquake killed thousands across the Pacific. The next Great Quake earthquake, when it comes, will probably kill fewer people, not because the earthquake itself will be smaller, it might be larger, but because the country and the basin have, over the past 149 years, learned how to live with the slab below them. That is what 150 years of paying attention looks like. The May 25th event is one moment in that attention. The next great event will be another moment. The decades between will be filled with monitoring, with research, with the slow, patient work of building a civilization on top of a tectonic system that does not negotiate. The work continues, the watching continues, and the slab 60 miles down continues to do what slabs do. Until then, the slab keeps moving. The continent keeps moving. The Andes keep rising at 10 millimeters per year. The trench keeps deepening. The interface keeps loading at 9 centimeters per year. The corridor stays silent on the boundary above the slab and noisy on the slab itself, breaking itself every few years in events like the one that happened on May 25th, while above it, the locked interface accumulates the strain that, eventually, will be released in a way that nobody now alive in northern Chile has ever experienced firsthand. And in the meantime, the people of Calama go to work. The miners at Chuquicamata go down into the world's deepest open pit and dig more copper. The tailings at Talabre sit behind their engineered embankment, holding back the slurry of crushed rock and chemicals that the mine has produced for over a century. The seismographs at the Chilean National Seismological Center record the small, constant tremors of a corridor that does not sleep. The GPS receivers placed across the Atacama tick off another millimeter of westward motion every week. The Andes rise, the trench deepens, the slab dives, and the clock that has been ticking on the Iquique Gap for 149 years adds another night to the count, and we keep watching. The watching is not passive. The watching is a centuries-long act of attention, conducted by generations of scientists and engineers and ordinary residents of this corridor, who have learned together how to live on top of a planet that does not, will not, and has never agreed to be still. The watching continues tonight. The watching continues tomorrow. And we keep watching 60 miles down into a planet that has never once, in the entire history of the species that lives on top of it, decided to sit still.